Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode on my channel, The Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and I'm joined today by Dr. Françoise Baylis. She is University Research Professor at Dalhousie University in Canada. The focus of her research is on issues of women's health and assisted reproductive technologies, but her research and publication record also extend to such topics as research involving humans, including human embryo research, gene editing, novel genetic technologies, public health, the role of bioethics consultants, and neuroethics. She also has a forthcoming book on ethics and heritable genome editing, which will be published by Harvard University Press. So, Dr. Baylis, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so let's start off with this because my audience, I guess that they are mostly very intellectual people and they are aware of some of the current issues. But could you please explain what is the CRISPR-Cas9 system and how it works?
So, first of all, CRISPR is an acronym, and it stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats. So that's a mouthful, so it's been shortened to CRISPR. The main thing to understand is it's the newest, if you will, of a series of technologies which allow scientists to go in and make changes to the genome. So previously we had something called zinc finger nuclease, we had talons, we had various other technologies, and along comes CRISPR. And that's in 2012. We have Jennifer Doudna, an American scientist, along with Emmanuel Charpentier, who together do the work that allows us to understand that we have a new way, if you will, of going in and making genetic changes. So basically what this technology allows the scientists to do is to make what's called a double-stranded cut. So most people know that DNA is a helix, I don't know how you say that, helixical, but it's a helix. It's in that shape of a helix. And basically, you have something called Cas9, which people refer to as molecular scissors. The Cas9 goes in and makes a cut, and then one of two things happens. The DNA either repairs itself, or the scientists have put in something in order for it to have a template to get a new set of strand of DNA, and that's called the guide RNA, which takes, that's the CRISPR, the guide RNA takes in the molecular scissors, they make the cut, and they either allow it to repair itself, or they try to affect the repair by introducing new material. So that's an explanation from a non-scientist. I'm sure a scientist would be much more precise, but I think that gets across the sort of general understanding of what's at issue here.
Sure, and I wanted to keep that part simple and straight as possible. So just for people to get the basic notions of how that system operates. But anyhow, this system can be used in all types of living cells, right?
That's correct. So people anticipate that this could have huge implications, for example, in terms of agriculture, in terms of modification of farm animals, fish, aquatic life, etc., and also humans. And so it's in that context that we've seen a fair bit of concern with respect to how might this technology be used? How might it change, for example, our food production? How might it change, for example, insects that we would consider pests at this point? But also, how might it affect human health? And how might it affect beyond things that might generally come under the banner of therapies to make changes that we would consider enhancements.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that it is very important right now for us to establish a distinction here, because since it can be applied in all types of cells, in the case of humans, for example, other animals as well, of course, but let's stick to humans now. It can be applied both in somatic cells and also in germline cells, and that makes a big difference, correct?
Absolutely. So just so that everyone understands, when we talk about somatic cells, we're basically talking about any of the body cells except for the reproductive cells. The reproductive cells would be your gametes, so for example, sperm and egg, and also all of the precursor cells to making the gametes. As well, we talk about the early human embryo, which would be right after we've got the egg and sperm together. So by and large, when we talk about the technology of genome editing, we talk about it as happening in somatic cells, which are the body cells, or we talk about it happening in the germline cells, which, as I've said, are the gametes, the precursors to the gametes, and the early human embryo. The main difference between making manipulations in either of those two types of cells is that when you make the changes to somatic cells, body cells, you're only having an impact on the individual person, the individual patient. So if you were to make those changes with me, I would be the only person who would experience those changes. If, however, you made those changes in my germ cells, so you affected my ova, for example, or an early embryo that I made with a partner, for example, those changes would appear in the next generation and the generation after that, et cetera, et cetera. So then you're actually looking at making a change over time and all subsequent generations. And in that context, people have some reservations.
Exactly. And so, in general, what are some of the main types of applications that this technology might have in humans?
Well, if we're thinking about it in, for example, a somatic context, and we're thinking about it in terms of therapies, people are looking right now to perhaps make changes in what are generally called a family of single gene disorders, where they're not very complicated, not to say that all genetic changes would be complicated, I grant you that, but what they imagine is being able to go in and make these simple corrections, simple in quotation marks. An example that's often used is Huntington's disease. And so the idea there is that everybody inherits genes from both of their parents, from their mother and father. And there are certain diseases where if you get one defective gene from one parent, you're going to either express that or be a carrier for that disease. And what they're looking at, for example, with Huntington's is a situation whereby there's a defect in the Huntington gene, and that defect is known as what's called a CAG repeat. And basically, a person with Huntington's disease has too many of those repeats. And CAG is literally CAG, and it refers to the building blocks of the DNA. And so basically, the hope would be to be able to go in and to remove those excess repeats, and in that way to offer, if you will, some kind of a therapy to a patient. Now, whether that can work or not is probably a fair ways off in the distance. But that's the kind of ideas that you can identify a very specific error, if you will, in the genome, and you go in to try to make a correction. In this case, the correction would be to remove some genetic material. In another case, it might be to insert some genetic material or to alter some genetic material, etc. So that's a sort of a simple idea of what the hope would be for a therapy. Some people, though, would say, well, why would we make this correction or this change in this patient with Huntington's disease without at the same time trying to make sure that when they reproduce, they no longer have the risk that their child would have this disease? And so in that context, they're looking to make a change to the germline. They're looking to have an impact on subsequent generations. So that's a sort of a simple kind of example of what people imagine on the positive side of what could happen.
Sure. And I guess that at this point there may have been some people that have already said something along the lines of, oh, but what you're talking about is a little bit too futuristic and this won't be happening anytime soon. But I mean, that's not really the case, because this technology is moving and evolving incredibly quickly, correct?
Well, so the technology is moving quite quickly if you think about it as science. And by that, people will often point to the fact that you see exponential growth in terms of the number of publications, that are referring to CRISPR, and that they say, relatively speaking, because it's easy, it's cheap, it's precise, etc., that you have a considerable amount of uptake around the world, people trying different things, and so it's moving quickly in that sense. How quickly it will move from the lab to a clinical trial to eventually at the bedside, I think is anyone's guess. And I say that because there are people that are quite enthusiastic and really do imagine that this will happen quickly. But, from the time that I've been working on the ethics of genetic and reproductive technologies, we were supposed to have gene therapies a long time ago, and we're only now on the cusp of seeing those come to fruition. So I'm not a good one to make predictions in terms of time. And I think what I would say is that we should really focus on the ethics of what we're doing, so that in some sense requires time in order to figure out where should we go with this technology.
Mm-hmm. And anyway, it is certainly not too soon to already be thinking about some of the main, at least ethical considerations that it can bring about in the future, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, if you're sort of a student, if you will, of this area of science, you can go back and you can find a number of classic articles written as far back as 100 years ago, predicting that this is the direction in which we might eventually go, and saying there, that, look, we can't do it now, but now is the time to be thinking about this. What are the ramifications? What are the implications? And the idea is that if you start thinking about it, then you can try to direct the science in a direction that you think will benefit humanity. And I think that for me is really a very, very important consideration, something I would want to underline. Science can be used for good and for ill, and the question is, how do you make sure that you're by and large reaping the benefits while trying to constrain in some way, shape, or form what could be the harms? Because none of this is going to be harm-free.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and I guess that we can say that technology by itself is never good or bad. What is good or bad is the way people use the technology, right?
I think that's true, and often when I'm teaching, I give as an example a very simple technology. If you imagine a hammer, right? This can be used to build a home for homeless people. You could think about this as in the shape of a gavel that a judge would use ceremoniously in the context of, making a decision in terms of what is just in the world. And it can also be a murder weapon, right? And so I think that that's absolutely true, that any kind of technology can be used for good or for ill. I think the thing we have to pay attention to, though, is the context. And I think right now we are living in very difficult and challenging times. And so in that context, where you see a number of belief systems being articulated that I would describe as discriminatory, if not racist, then I think there's reason to be worried about who will have control of the technology, how will they choose to use this technology, how might it be weaponized? And I don't think we can shy away from those kinds of questions. I mean, I don't think we can shy away from them at any time. But I think particularly at this time, when we look at what's happening globally, we ought to be concerned about how this science might be used.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And now let's move on to some more specific aspects. So we already talked a little bit about the difference between applying this technology to altering the genome in germline cells and in somatic cells. But I think there's also a very important aspect that we have to consider from an ethical perspective, let's say, that is the difference between enhancement and therapy.
Right. So a lot of people draw that distinction, and historically, people have said with respect to this technology and similar technologies that therapeutic use is ethically acceptable and that enhancements are ethically impermissible. And I think that that's actually too simplistic a divide for a number of reasons. First of all, it's actually a fuzzy line. There are ways in which we can think about an intervention as being both a therapy and an enhancement, depending on your perspective. So a simple example that's often used is the example of somebody who is of short stature. So you might be short because you have an underlying medical condition, or you might be short because your parents are short and it's completely expected that you would be short. And on a population level, for example, the population might be short because of restricted access to food and nutrition, right? So there are many things that can make for influencing a person's stature in terms of their height, if you will. So if I have a person who has an underlying health condition, comes to see me and would like growth hormone treatment or eventually some kind of genome editing, and somebody else who comes to me and says, I'm short because my parents are short and I would like to be taller, would I say in one case I'm offering a therapy and in another case I'm offering an enhancement? You could say that, but it seems to me that what you're trying to do is you're trying to recognize that you have a similar problem. The problem is actually a social problem. It's one of discrimination. We have good data that shows that people who are of short stature, especially men, for example, are discriminated in the workplace. So if you thought that's the problem that we're addressing, then both of them have the exact same lived experience. Why would we call one an enhancement and say, well, that's bad or that's questionable, but the other one's a therapy and that's good and should be provided? Now, don't get me wrong. I actually think we shouldn't be using biological solutions to social problems. I actually think if we have a social problem like discrimination, we ought to try and fix it. At the same time, I recognize that it takes time to make those kinds of social changes, and people and parents would be looking to try to make sure that their child has a good life or a chance at a good life, and so it wouldn't be unreasonable for them to try to address the problem biologically. But that's just one kind of example why what you have is a very fuzzy line between therapy and enhancement. So one of the things that I've tried to do is to get people to think about all of those changes as an enhancement. Because if you think enhancement just means improvement, in any case, you're trying to do an improvement. It either is a medically related kind of improvement or it's a socially related kind of improvement. But either way, it's an attempt to improve the biology or the social context, etc. So I think if we would talk about all of it as a kind of enhancement or all of it as genome editing or all of it as genome modification or whatever language we use, we won't fall back on the easy solution of therapy good, enhancement bad.
Okay, so there's a fuzzy line between enhancement and therapy. But just let's just bring an example to the table, and it's again fuzzy. But let's talk about, for example, a case in the future in which rich parents will have a child and they make some genetic tests, let's say, and we already have a complete account of the genes that influence IQ. And someone calculates it and they arrive at the conclusion that if they have the child as it is, she will be born with an IQ of, I don't know, 100, for example, the average IQ. But those parents, because they want for that child to have as a bright future as she can, they want to enhance it and to change some of the genes to higher up the IQ and for it to reach, for example, 120. Okay, so this, I guess, would be enhancement. But for example, if someone would know that her child would be born with an IQ of 70, which is already a bit dysfunctional, would you say that elevating the IQ for around, for example, the 90s or even 100 would be considered a therapy, and the ethical issue there between the two situations would be different?
Well, I think intelligence is a really complicated issue because we actually already have a lot of very good data to say that there are huge environmental contributions to that. That's why, for example, the same parents who are very rich try to have private tutors or send their children to schools that are quite expensive that they believe provide a better education, et cetera, et cetera. So first of all, intelligence is an extremely complicated character trait, if you will. But we do believe that there is a genetic component, so I grant that. In that context, though, I think what becomes really important is to recognize that we already think of all of this as enhancements, right? And we just, in that case, the divide isn't so much between therapy and enhancement, but between environmental enhancements, which we already endorse. I gave you the example of paying for the private tutor, and then biological enhancements. So then what becomes interesting is the debate is about the means, not the ends, because we already agree on the ends. We agree that it's a good thing to enhance one's intellectual capacities. And without even using the examples, of an IQ of 70 or 100 and 120, there are philosophers who have written about this and said one of our problems as a species is we're actually not smart enough to solve the problem of war. And so maybe what we need is to enhance all of ourselves, even the ones who think that they're very smart, so that we could actually get to a point that we could understand what it is we need to do as a society to make our lives better. The philosopher who talks about this quite some time ago is Jonathan Glover, and he actually makes what I think is a very funny observation. We don't ask our dogs to do algebra. And so we would have to enhance them for them to be able to have that capacity. We would have to enhance humans for them to have the capacity to do certain kinds of things. So I think what's interesting there is to then pull back and say, is the goal something like what we would refer to as species typical functioning? And that's when you're sort of trying to figure out, well, this is sort of the norm for the population. Some people are falling below that norm, and should we do something to bring them up? Well, one of the things that's complicated about that is the things that we value, the traits that we value, actually change over time. And so it seems like, well, no, intelligence is one of those things that isn't going to change, and we really like that. But, in philosophy, we ask the question, is it better to be a happy pig or an unhappy Socrates? And it's not an unreasonable kind of question. So, how intelligent do you really want to be? How painful can the ability to have and amass a lot of knowledge be in terms of one's increased understanding of the awful world in which we live in? Maybe we'd all be better off to not understand how awful that is and to live in a more sort of happy-go-lucky way. So I'm trying to make that a little bit entertaining. But it becomes more dramatic because when people give the example of enhancement, they don't just talk about intelligence. They also, for example, talk about aesthetics. Typically, they say blonde hair, blue eyes. Well, neither of us have blonde hair and blue eyes, right? Is that what we want? And do you really then want over time to have society be homogeneous? Do you really want to work and live in a world where everybody has blonde hair and blue eyes? I think we need to be really careful about what we think is an improvement. And I think in part that's what I was wanting to say. So if we go back to the example I gave about height, what's too tall? Do we have a concept of too tall right now? I mean, if you want to play basketball, maybe there is no such thing as too tall. But if you actually just want to work in the world, be able to get into the car and not have your head touching the top of the car, be able to walk through the door and not have to bend every time, maybe there is a maximum. And what that shows you is how biology is always in a social context. And it always depends what it is that you're hoping to do. And what I'm hoping to do is not to enhance individuals so that they have some kind of privilege like the, amazingly tall basketball player, but really to look at humans in a broad social global context and say, what's good for us as a people, for all of us? And there I think we can look at some very specific things where genome editing could make a huge beneficial change for us all.
And it works at a societal level and also at a broader environmental level, because let's say that if for some reason we decided to modify all of people's genome just to improve all the phenotypic traits, let's say that we could, then if we were working at the genetic level and eliminating all variation, then in the future, and this is also from an evolutionary perspective, if and when the environmental conditions changed enough, let's say, then we could be led toward a situation where perhaps the species would go extinct because we wouldn't have enough variation to deal with those changes, for example.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we just know that diversity in the grand scheme of things is, something that would be quite positive. But I'd like to pick up on one of the comments you made about the possibility of extinction. And one of the things that I think is actually quite interesting is, again, to look at this technology in its broader social context. I would say back to you that we are right now, in colloquial English, pissing in our sandbox. And what I mean by that is we're destroying our environment, right? We know that. We understand that we have increased problems in terms of pollution, in terms of food security, in terms of, nuclear accidents, et cetera, et cetera. We are in the process of destroying our planet. Now, in that context, we could do one of two things. for me, the obvious thing is stop. Stop doing those things that are destroying the planet. But that requires everybody to be part of that. And right now, we don't seem to have a lot of collegial, collaborative work happening on that front. In fact, we still have a number of people denying that there are these kinds of environmental or climatic changes. So other people, and now we are in the realm of science fiction, but interesting science fiction, would say maybe what we need to do is actually start modifying humans such that they could live in this polluted environment. So maybe what we need to do is to make sure that humans have the ability to breathe toxic air, or they have the ability to drink toxic water, or what have you. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not advocating that. I'm actually saying what we should be doing is not wrecking our environment in the first place. But I think what's interesting is if you consider that possibility, you then actually bring to the fore an effort to prioritize the way we spend our time, our money, our talent, etc. Because the other alternative is if we're not going to change ourselves to live on this planet, then we need to change ourselves to live on some other planet. And either way, those become interesting philosophical debates because it then really highlights that interplay between genetics and environment. And it shows you maybe you don't want to solve an environmental problem by making genetic changes. Why? Because those changes are risky. Those changes will be made in the context of the unknown, and there really is a different approach which would involve not stressing, if you will, the biology of the human.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's now say that, for example, in a few years we would have the CRISPR-Cas9 technology available to make some enhancements in humans, but of course due to economic disparity it would only be accessible to the richest people and the poorer ones wouldn't have access to it. So could that be considered, if the richest people were to use that technology, a form of eugenics?
Well, I think those are certainly the predictions that have been made. And again, you can go back easily 20, 30, 40 years, and you can see that in the literature. And, you know, Lee Silver is one person who's written about this some 20 years ago, and he talked about the gen rich and the naturals, right? Those who haven't been modified and those who have been genetically modified. And certainly that's what you would anticipate, that those with the resources, those of a certain socioeconomic class, certain kinds of powerful elites would get access to the technology to try to improve their situation. One of the real problems there is that what you then do is you actually take what is already social privilege and you in fact inscribe that in DNA. Well, that's a huge change if we do that, right? So the first thing then is to think about what are the implications of that in terms of the disparities we're already witnessing. We live at a time when people now worry and know what it means to talk about the 1%. When I was a kid, that concept didn't exist. But now the 1% is that elite group that is really running the show. And the rest of us, the 99%, are wallowing in different kinds of, scenarios. It is to say that some of that 99% is also still very well off. But you've got this great gap now between the very, very uber wealthy and the rest of society. Well, what happens when that gap is not just in terms of social benefits, but also in terms of genetics? Well, that's huge. Having said that, I think one of the things I worry about again, though, is the world that we're building. And what I would ask people to think about is the following. Aside from the United States, most, I would say, civilized countries have some kind of government-funded healthcare system. And many of those countries also have government investment in science. And one of the things that I worry about is the following. If my government, and I live in Canada, so if my government chooses to invest in the science of genome editing, I want to know that whatever benefits come from that research are going to be available to me because I was part of the venture capital. You took my tax dollars, you invested it in science. Science came up with some kind of intervention from which I could benefit. Well, then I better be able to get access to that through my government-funded healthcare system. Now, that's the ideal world. I worry that that's not how the world is going to work. And so then I think we're actually looking at a really different kind of ethical problem that people are not paying attention to, which is that the people at least through taxation, are the venture capitalists. Never mind that I understand corporations will come and be involved, and the private sector will be involved, and big pharma will be involved. But the fact of the matter is, if governments are also investing heavily in this science for the betterment of humanity, then we need to know that they are at the same time willing to make a comparable investment in the delivery of the benefits of that science. And I think that's where we haven't had enough conversation to make sure that's happening. Because there's no point investing in the science if you're not going to invest in the distribution of those benefits.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's just talk about this thought experiment. Let's say that in the near future, I don't know exactly when, richer people would have access to this technology and they could enhance themselves, or they could use it for therapeutic ends, let's say. And for example, there were people, children of richer parents that were to have some health issues, and then their parents would use the technology to eliminate those diseases. Let's stick to diseases now. Let's stick to the therapeutic side of things. But that wouldn't happen to people that were part of poorer families, because they wouldn't have the economic means to do it. So even if we just stick to the therapeutic side of things, would you say that it would still be unethical to apply that technology to people with more resources and not the other ones? Because here we'll also have to consider the fact that that child that comes from a rich family would have lived with that disease, for example.
Well, I think there's a couple of things to think about here. I mean, one of them is, I do think, again, it's really important to not just look at this individually, one family, one set of children, but to look at it socially. And I think you're inviting a whole lot of problems in terms of increased discrimination, increased marginalization, etc. All of these negative social traits, characteristics, realities, if you allow this gap to continue to increase. Quite frankly, I think we're already in some way, shape, or form on the path to a certain kind of revolution, in the sense that I think we have a situation right now which is not that dissimilar to what we saw in France with, Marie Antoinette and let them eat cake. Well, if you keep doing this, if you keep privileging yourself at the expense of everybody else, at some point the masses will stand up and they will revolt. And therefore, I think it's in everyone's interest to think carefully about what would be fair and equitable distribution of the benefits of these resources. I can think, for example, that it would be really good to develop genome editing technology for prophylaxis, to develop vaccines for all of society so that we can all benefit from the technology. I really worry about continuing down a path where we tolerate excessive privilege for people who, through either luck or happenstance or hard work, have managed to already be, if you will, at the top of the pyramid, and you just can't ignore the rest of us in the social context. And so I just think it's in no one's interest, either from a principled or a pragmatic perspective, to continue to allow this extraordinary gap between the very privileged and the rest of us. It's just not, it's unethical, and it's also not wise.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when we're evaluating a novel technology like the CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing technology, we really have to have a more broader perspective about it and evaluate it at several levels. So it's not really just the technology and how it's applied, it's the effects that it have at the societal level, and even at a certain point you refer to something that we could already consider to be at the existential level when we talked about being intelligent and being intelligent above a certain level, because we probably wouldn't be very happy with it. So it is really a multifaceted thing to do ethics on novel technologies like this, right?
So in this context, I and a number of other colleagues have really been arguing for something that we referred to as broad societal consensus with respect to trying to direct this technology. And part of the reason for that is to say there will be broad societal implications. And so given that we can already anticipate, no matter what we do, that there will be huge consequences for all of us. Why? Because in some sense, you're talking about manipulating the human genome, and the genome doesn't belong to anybody. And when I say that, I recognize it's not one genome. That's kind of like a caricature, right? But the bottom line is, if you're thinking of making those kinds of dramatic changes that you imagine being repeated generation after generation and added to generation after generation, it seems that we ought to go through some kind of a deliberative exercise where we try to figure out, how do we want to direct that science? What do we want to set as the priorities? Right now, the priorities, quite frankly, are being set idiosyncratically by individual research teams that have a particular area of interest or expertise. So, for example, I decide I want to work on thalassemias because that's what I know, and so I've decided I'll put all of this energy and talent into that particular project. But maybe from the perspective of broad societal consensus, we'd say, well, look, that's an interesting project, but we got a more important one. Let's use that technology to identify and address a broader, more widespread, or more broadly understood to be a priority. And so one of the things I worry about with this technology is who sets the priorities. Is it individual scientists? Is it individual nations? Is it certain clusters of extremely wealthy people? And right now, I'm worried that none of those possible zones of decision making include all of us. And my work right now is really to say, I'm making a claim, I'm staking some territory. I'm saying, if you want to make these kinds of decisions about this kind of science, you have to find ways to involve all of us in that decision making. And if you think about the conversation we've had thus far, it started off with kind of like, I would say, the simplest kind of primer, if you will, about the science. And the rest of it is conversation about what's important in the world. And there's nobody who's going to tell me or persuade me that there isn't every single human being who can have a conversation about what's important in the world. Now, we're going to have very different perspectives because we're all very differently situated. Those conversations are going to be extremely hard. I don't even know how we would make them happen because, quite frankly, the things like social media, which were supposed to be boons, have also turned out to have some very nefarious negative consequences. But because it's such a huge challenge doesn't mean we walk away from it. It means we grab it. We take the bull by the horns and we say, this is the priority. We need to figure out a solution to it. And it's a complicated solution because it isn't actually simple science in a lab. It's actually science in the world. It's social science. It's about how do you get humans to come together around a common project. And we don't know how to do that, right? Like, that's a really complicated problem. But why aren't we investing just as much time, talent, energy into solving that problem, which can have huge benefits and spillover effects, not just for genome editing, but for all kinds of science, all kinds of priorities.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and just another thing, I think that there's also another level here that we haven't touched too much on it. I guess that at a certain point you referred to the fact that we could use also this technology and apply it to, for example, mosquitoes. So there's also the level of the more broader ecosystem, the biosphere, and also animal rights. So, for example, we could also apply this technology in mosquitoes to try to prevent them transmitting diseases to humans like malaria, for example. But there's also the fact that we could use it to completely change a species and modify the way it interacts with other species at the local level and change that ecosystem. And also at the level of the lab, we can also apply it in animal models, and so there's also animal ethics included in there, right?
Absolutely. I think that there's, this is really just such a huge area of science because of the multiple places in which you can imagine some kind of an impact. But one of the things that's actually quite interesting to me, and I don't have a very sophisticated perspective on this yet, but what I've noticed is that scientists who are working in non-human organisms, so people working in plants, in insects, in farm animals, etc., when they justify or explain their science, very often they explain it in terms or justify it in terms of trying to address a problem for humanity. Now, in terms of animal ethics, for example, some people would say, well, maybe that's the wrong target. Maybe if you're looking to modify animals, you should be looking out for their own benefits. But right now, I'm just offering a description. Scientists who work with insects are looking to correct or address a problem for humanity, for example, in terms of infection. Scientists who are working, for example, in plants, like an example would be rice or flour, they're looking to solve a problem for humanity. And the same is true with other kinds of interventions. The only scientists who don't talk broadly about helping humanity are the ones working on humans. They're the ones that are looking at a discrete, narrow group of humans, right? They're saying, well, these kinds of humans with this kind of, medical problem, or humans with this kind of desire, for example, people who want to have genetically related children but can't do it using pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, in vitro fertilization, or any of the other technologies that we have. So the scientists working in humans are always looking to try and benefit little discrete groups of humans. And I want to say, think big. Right? Don't make individual small groups of humans your first target. I'm not saying that those are not priorities, but I'm saying surely the bigger priority is any science that would benefit all of us, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, so Dr. Baylis, just before we go, could you tell us a little bit about your upcoming book, when it will be out, and perhaps a little bit about what you're going to talk about in there?
So the book will cover a number of these topics, but in greater depth. I think one of the major differences in terms of the scope of conversation is that in there, there'll be a chapter on slow science. And really, it's a defense of the need to build time, protected time, into the scientific process, that too often right now we're racing to get somewhere, and in part we're racing to get somewhere because we're running after money. And so what I ask is, what would the world look like if we had more time to do science? Wouldn't the science be better? And wouldn't the science answer better questions? Because guess what? You'd spend a whole lot more time figuring out what the right question is. And nowadays, there isn't that kind of time built in. There's just a lot of time pressures. I need to publish. I need to get a grant. I need to have a patent. I need to publish, and it's a vicious cycle. So there's a long discussion there about slow science and the benefits of that. Also, there's a couple of chapters which look directly at the issue of policy making and science policy. And in those chapters, I explore what are the possible roles that scientists could play in terms of contributing to science policy. And I go through a bunch of different alternatives, and obviously I have some opinions about what scientists should do. And I also have a parallel chapter which does the exact same thing for ethicists. And so I'm hoping there to offer sort of a critical perspective on at least two professional groups that I think have special responsibilities in terms of moving the conversation forward, always in my mind with a view to involving everybody. So I'm defending very strongly the claim that we, all of us, have a say. We, all of us, ought to benefit. And at least certain communities who are very knowledgeable about different aspects of the problem, and so I'm thinking scientists and I'm thinking ethicists, have real moral responsibilities to make those conversations happen, to facilitate those deliberations. And I think that that's where I'm hoping that I can have an impact. I hope I'll be persuasive, and that we'll build a better world. Because I think that we have the ability, some of us have the will, and what we really need to do is to spread that goodwill.
Okay, very well. Does it already have a title?
Well, it does, in the sense that I have a title, but my title is quite esoteric. And so I have a little play on words where I'm sort of asking about, what would it mean to be human after we do all of these kinds of interventions? And so I'm playing with the notion of our cells, our meaning O-U-R, cells, C-E-L-L-S, and ourselves, O-U-R-S-E-L-V-E-S. So you can sort of see the little bit of an attempt of a play on words. Ourselves, and recognizing that we are the sum of all these cells, but that as we make changes to individual cells, how are we changing ourselves as people in the world? So, but it's a little obscure. I get to explain it to you and your listeners, but I think the average reader wouldn't necessarily know that that's about genome editing. So we're going to make sure we get the title to have ethics and genome editing in there so it's clear, and maybe we'll still get my fanciful reference to ourselves and ourselves.
Okay, interesting. Can you already tell us something about when it will be out?
We expect the book to be published in 2019, so hopefully look for it in the late spring, early summer.
Okay, very well. So just before we go, would you like to also tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Absolutely. So I actually have work on the internet in a number of places, but I do have a website, and you can get to it by putting in impact ethics. And that's actually a reference to some of my earlier work that was more philosophical, saying that there's an obligation to have an impact in the world, that this is not just an ivory tower exercise. So if you put in impact ethics, you might get to my website, but the other place you might get to is my blog. So either way, hopefully you'll get to both places. The website includes information about a variety of projects that we're working on. One of the ones that's quite interesting now is called the body economy, and we're just looking at the ethics of selling body parts. And there, I think what might be interesting to some is the difference between selling your eggs, your sperm, your embryos, which overlaps with today's conversation, versus selling your organs, selling your blood, selling your hair. What does it mean to turn the human body into a commodity? So that's a kind of teaser to get you to the website. And the blog covers every kind of imaginable topic, and anyone listening to this is actually welcome to even submit something for publication.
Okay, very well. I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of this video for people to go and check it out.
Great.
Dr. Baylis, it was really a pleasure. I think it was a very interesting conversation and a very relevant one. And again, thank you for taking the time to come on the show, and maybe in the future, perhaps after your book is out, we could have another conversation.
That would be great, and thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and see if you can make a pledge there. I would really be thankful for that. And finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanche, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas and Jim Frank. Thank you a lot for all.